To the channel, everyone. So today's topic is going to be, why are there so many foundries, right? Why are all these versions of the same thing? I've heard people speculate on various theories, so I'm going to give mine. I do want to say this is a speculative video. I don't know this to be the case or anything like that. This is my theory. All the foundries, right? So if you work in tech, you know there's icons everywhere. You probably know it anyway. But yeah, there's like Foundry for crypto and Foundry for life sciences and Foundry for utils and Foundry for beer, right? So um, you know, it's kind of weird. You're like, oh, this product is saying, for all these various use cases, why don't you just have one product that covers them all? But for us to understand this, I want us to go back in time, right? And let's get in the way back machine and let's go back to 2006 when I was living in Costa Rica and Amazon had just launched EC2 and developers were uploading files with FileZilla up to their, rack servers somewhere. And AWS comes out with this thing for EC2, which is virtualized compute that we all use today. It's pay by the SIP. You're not having to like upfront your costs. You pay for only for what you use. And S3, which is block storage, right? Or sorry, object storage. And S3 is a really, really cheap and durable storage system that let us store just about anything. And then IAM were permissions on top of these two things. And back in 2006, he solved real problems that a lot of developers had. Because especially when you were a small company, if you were a small company and you were trying to use rack space or use a dedicated host or any of these things, it was a total pain in the butt, right? And the way you had to administer everything was through some shitty GUI interface, and you were always uploading files via FTP and SFTP. It was a total pain, right? And so Amazon comes along with this new compute model using virtualization and a new type of virtualization that made it really easy for developers to use and really, really cost effective. But people forget they got kicked in the teeth for a long time. Yes, they had big revenue growth year over year, but they didn't make inroads into the enterprise space for a really, really, really long time, right? And the reason is that this was a big shift for enterprises to go out of their own data centers, out of their own racks, into someone else's virtual environments and networks. It's kind of a non-starter for a really long time, and it was really startups that were taking advantage of this. And so, if we look at their revenue growth, if we go all the way back here and we start looking at '09, they really didn't hit the inflection point until 2014 when the hypergrowth really kicked in. And that was when they got over $1 billion in revenue. And again, like, enterprises didn't jump on the AWS bandwagon right away. In fact, they're still trying to get big enterprises who are really concerned about their compliance and their legal requirements onto the AWS platform. And what was really funny about it too is where Amazon had the most success was their simplest fucking solution, which was S3. And this is just vanilla storage, right? But enterprises loved it because it solved this problem where they're having to maintain their own tape backups, right? And like maintain their own backup system and spending all this money and time having engineers back up data for them. So S3 actually was a big inroad into the enterprise space. And it wasn't all these other awesome services they had that brought those customers on board. It was this really simple, really vanilla use case, and where they made tons and tons of revenue with the big players. Startups were much more likely to jump on board with the new services and offerings. But even then, their top services today are still these really vanilla, simple services like EC2, like SQS, like S3. They're not like the really complicated machine learning platforms or anything like that. Although those things are coming up, that's still not the heavy hitters and what generates most of their revenue. Now, let's imagine for a moment that instead of Andy Jassy selling 3 services, right, he was selling over 200. So if you guys look at this is known as in the industry as the AWS Death Star. And it's a sort of visualization of all of the various services in AWS and how they connect together. If you were selling this to customers back in 2006, they would have told you to fuck off because no one would have been able to wrap their brain around what you were talking about. Like cloud compute, what is that? And what the hell is this service mesh? And what's a microservice? They would have just told you to get out. There would have been a non-starter. Everyone would have been shutting the door in their face until eventually they realized, oh, microservice architecture has some real benefits for scaling. It has some real benefits for decoupling my teams and letting them be autonomous. But that took the better part of a decade to teach developers how to think that way. And so a lot of people don't realize, Amazon was a decade ahead of developers in microservice architecture. It was going to take a real, and this is the brainchild of Bezos. Bezos has been a huge proponent of microservices and service contracts and stuff like that for a very long time. It's something that I think was a bit of a secret of his. But anyway, if they were selling this back in the day, no one would have bought it. Now, imagine you're selling two of them, right? Imagine you got two flavors of this thing, Foundry and Gotham. You're like, you got two Death Stars, and then you got this thing Apollo, which has got its own fleet of like Star Destroyers that come right along with it, right? So like, what in the hell are you talking about? And so I think for the most part, what's happening here is like the reason they create these different versions of Foundry is to find a use case that developers can wrap their arms around and not feel like they're drinking from a fire hose when they try and digest the platform. And that was definitely the experience. The number one criticism I received from when we evaluated Foundry was that, it felt like a rocket ship and we're just trying to cross the street. It's very intimidating for developers when you're bringing in a new way of thinking, a new way of building software, a new world they're going to enter, and they've got to wrap their brains around it all, and it's just no, right? So Palantir is trying to find the killer use case. And they want developers to be able to digest it. But I think that, they also have to build those use cases with clients where there's a client who's willing to pay for it, in my opinion. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the way I feel about it. Is I know that that's the way we've approached a lot of creating software at other places I've been, is you find the customer who's willing to pay for it, you create the use case, and then you have a template to follow, and you can replicate that for every customer after that. So for me, and I might actually get to do this with my company, we'll see. But I have a recommendation for the killer use case. Foundry for ML Ops, right? Bring your own lakehouse, deploy everywhere, and win the edge. Because this is where we're spending all of our fucking time right now. It's a complete waste of money. There's insane amount of undifferentiated heavy lifting. We're all doing the same shit, and we're all doing it wrong in the same places. And it's not bringing any science to the equation, right? It's like, we spend 3/4 of our time doing the ops side, and we get to spend 1/4 of our time or less actually doing science, right? And Palantir knows how to do this at scale. So my advice, and the thing I want to see, is Foundry for ML Ops. And I think that this would be the killer use case for Palantir, and I might actually get to build it or try and attempt to build some of it where I work. So stay tuned.